Welcome to another day of AP European. Obviously, I am not here because I'm feeling horrible, so you are going to have to listen to this instead of listening to me in person, and I'm very sorry. Last time we spoke, Charles had come back, Charles II, and he was restored as king to England. Unfortunately, though, after he died, his brother, his very dumb brother, became king. And James, as we maybe talked about last time, James was not at all bright. He tried to restore absolutism. He was interested in practicing Catholicism openly, to which he actually converted to in France while he was living there with Charles II. And his wife, who is also Catholic, gave birth to children, and this scared the Parliament because they were worried that they would have another Catholic king, not to mention that James wanted to bring back absolutism. So they offered James the choice of either dying or leaving the throne. And James chooses to leave. He abdicates the throne. And this is an incredibly important moment, because what this actually does is this is the defining moment in constitutional history, really for the Western world, in that there was no war, there was no blood, there was no major coup necessary in order to establish a constitutional-style government. And that is one of the things that sets England apart. James II's daughter, a much older daughter from his first marriage, is actually Protestant, and she is married to William of Orange of the Netherlands, the House of Orange, the very same people that pushed Philip II out. And Parliament decides that she and her husband William, both of whom are staunchly Protestant, are the right people to come. But before they come over, they are required to sign something called the Bill of Rights. And this is a significant moment also in British history, because the Bill of Rights establishes the concept of parliamentary supremacy. And this is something you should probably circle with your blood or your tears or whatever you need to circle it with, because it's an incredibly important concept. Essentially, what the parliamentary supremacy does is it establishes Parliament as the supreme body of legislation in the country. The King and Queen are still the executive heads, but they are now ruling on behalf of Parliament. And that is a big difference before, where Parliament was ruling on behalf, or Parliament was legislating on behalf of the monarchs. So now they are required to rule by right of Parliament, and this is still the case today. And some historians have actually referred to this as a democratic monarchy. In other words, the monarchy is controlled and rules based on a democratically elected body. Now, obviously, Parliament is not yet democratically elected, but they will be soon enough. So, other important concepts in the Bill of Rights is that they have free elections, and by free elections they mean that people can vote unimpeded as they may need to for the members of Parliament, but this is only referring to the wealthiest members of society. The poor absolutely have no rights, and the middle class have no right to vote either. It's also free debate. So in other words, if you have policies that you don't like about that the monarchy is trying to introduce to Parliament, or issues in Parliament that the monarchy supports and you don't support them, you have the right to say you don't like that. You can debate about it, and you're not going to be locked away. Parliament must meet frequently, so going back to the old list of requirements that they wanted Charles to sign, bail must be reasonable, and we'll get into that a little bit later. You have to have a trial by jury, and finally, no taxation without parliamentary consent. The biggest one, really the most immediate, is that there was no war or military that is raised without parliamentary consent. So in other words, the king cannot engage in any kind of war without the consent of Parliament. And that means that Parliament now has control over the military, over the economy, and really over the justice system. So the king is there to support Parliament, and that's their main role. Right away, they start by passing something called the Toleration Act, which allows all Protestant faiths to openly be recognized and practiced. Still no good for Catholics. England's also worried that thanks in large part to Cromwell, but also because they don't know how James II, the king that just barely left, might act, they decide that the Irish Catholics must be entirely banned from participation in political society. So they pass something called the Penal Code. And this actually, once it's passed, makes the Irish the most repressed group in the 17th century. So the Penal Code banishes Catholic clergy. Catholics are forbidden to vote. Catholics cannot be in the Irish Parliament, which is also set up. Catholic teachers are forbidden to teach. Catholic parents cannot send children to Catholic schools, and Catholics are forbidden to buy land or own a horse worth more than £5. So this is an incredibly repressive law. It's basically to seal the final deal with Catholics in Ireland having any rights whatsoever. And Ireland really does become the most repressed region in Western Europe. Once William and Mary die, Mary's sister Anne comes in, and she is kind of this short, sweet, but very plump little queen who doesn't really do a whole lot. She oversees the Act of Union, but she actually never marries and she never has any heirs. You can see her clothes in the Westminster Abbey if you're interested and you're ever in London. She's just a tiny, fat little thing, kind of a sad woman. And really the only thing that happens is the Act of Union, where Scotland officially unites with England. So now you have the United Kingdom of England and Scotland. And this takes place in 1707. Once Anne dies, they bring in George I, who is the grandson of James I, from Hanover in Germany. And the Hanovers are the ones who rule England until Queen Victoria. The Hanovers are the Georges that you know of, perhaps from the American Revolutionary War, George III. But the problem that happens with the Hanoverians is that George I doesn't speak any English at all. And so he requires an interpreter. He appoints as a minister of aid a man named Sir Robert Walpole, who he relies on almost exclusively to help him govern England. And this is where you get the term prime minister developing from. The prime minister is not allowed to pick other ministers. That was reserved by right of the king. But once the king picks these ministers to help the prime minister run the government, they are called the cabinet, and they are responsible to Parliament. So they are held accountable for their actions by Parliament, thus maintaining parliamentary supremacy. And this is called the cabinet system. And this, in large part, is where our cabinet system in the U.S. comes from. George II, once George I dies, George II doesn't do a whole lot. He hates his father. George III hates his father. George III attempts in a small way to regain some kind of monarchical control within the parliamentary system. He does this by appointing Lord North as Prime Minister during the British Revolutionary War. This, of course, is a huge disaster, and when the war is over and George III has gone temporarily insane, a new parliamentarian, William Pitt, rises up, restores this kind of parliamentary supremacy within the House of Commons. And basically from this point forward, thanks in large part to William Pitt, the House of Commons really remains the dominant legislative force from this point on. You could argue the House of Lords has significant control, and they do, but the House of Commons has quite a bit of control within. So this is kind of the Glorious Revolution in a nutshell. I'm sorry that was so boring. I know it's not usually this bad. I hope it's not. But anyways, that's kind of the quick trajectory of what's going on. The other aspect, of course, is Louis XIV. So let's switch gears a little bit and go to Louis. In your notes, you see there is a chart on the front page, and it shows medieval government and absolutism. I'm not going to waste time by going over the medieval government part, because you can sit there and you can see it yourself. But I am going to go over the absolutism part so you can fill it out. So this is going to explain the basic outlines of how absolutism functions in France, and it functions much more effectively and is much more devastating to the nobility than, of course, it was in England, where essentially it backfired and Parliament became the most powerful body. So the opposite of what Charles I wanted happened. In France, Louis XIV comes of age when he's only 5, but it's important to look at a little bit of the backstory before we see what goes on with Louis XIV so that you can understand what's going on. First of all, the basic tenet of absolutism is the idea, of course, that you govern by divine right. You are there because God has anointed you as his sovereign, and you are answerable only to God. In terms of the government, how the governments are set up, the aristocracy traditionally, as you know, the nobility, use their positions for privileges and power, but you know that over time, thanks to, of course, Henry IV and Francis I and Louis XI, the Spider King, the nobles were already losing their power. And this culminated in a huge tension and resentment between the nobility and the king, as you know very well, resulting in, of course, the religious wars in France and what you'll see in a minute, the Fronde in France. So things that continue to happen that consolidate the power of the nobility in the bureaucracy is that appointments are made from the middle class. So in that little box next to the appointees or from the aristocracy, so under absolutism, in the bureaucracy, appointments are continually made from the middle class. Okay, they keep that policy going, and by they I mean Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu. In terms of salaries, because they are appointed from the middle class, the state pays salaries for these bureaucratic positions. Before this, there were no salaries. The aristocracy had their lands, they had their own income, so they weren't paid to be in these positions. But once the appointments were made from the middle class, the government starts paying them. Okay? In terms of the military, the king, as you know, depended on the nobles to raise private armies. In France, though, because of the religious wars and because of the 100 Years' War, the king developed an army that was permanently standing. So in other words, it was always there. So the king paid for a perpetual army that was loyal to him. He no longer had to rely on the nobility to do this. So he has an army at his beck and call. Finances are now no longer either dependent upon the nobility. They're no longer dependent on this kind of patchwork of tax systems. Finances are consolidated under state monopoly. So in other words, the king has control over all of the commodities and over all of the institutions in terms of taxes and trade. This, as you know too, was already starting under Louis XI and Francis I, but this is continued under Richelieu and Louis XIII, who we'll talk about in a minute, and Henry IV. And then finally, in terms of the nobility lose almost all power by the time Louis XIII and Richelieu come around in France. The king controls the nobles. By the time Louis XIV is around, the nobility have lost their power completely. They are completely neutered in terms of their power. So, who are Cardinal Richelieu and Louis XIII? That's the big question, okay? Louis XIII, when he comes to the throne, he's only 9 years old, so he needs a regent, somebody to rule for him. And Richelieu turns out to be this Catholic cardinal that actually cares about the welfare of this young king. And so he puts into place systems that would have made Louis XI and Francis I proud, because they not only consolidate control over the nobility, but they assert complete dominance over the nobility. The first of these are the intendants. The intendants are administrative officials, usually from the middle class. He divides France, and by he I mean Richelieu, divides France into 32 districts. The intendants are members of the merchant or middle class who are hired by the king in order to oversee these districts that he's created. They cannot be born or live within these districts when they're first appointed, because their whole existence is to maintain a system of checks to the local nobles. So not only do they govern over this district and make sure that the nobles are not taking advantage of the tax system, or that they're sending the required taxes back to the king, but they're also kind of spies, right? So they spy on the nobles, they ensure that the nobles are not whispering against the king, and they're incredibly effective. The other thing that happens is Richelieu standardizes French language. At this point in time, French language is completely bastardized. It sounds like gobbledygook at half of the places around France. Nobody can understand each other. So he finally standardizes the French language, which really ends up becoming Parisian French as the standard French. He also revives or introduces, depending on what historian you talk to, a tax called the corvée. That's C-O-R-V-E-E. And this is basically a labor tax that is placed upon peasants around the country, so that when roads or infrastructure maintenance is required, the peasants can be used free, because it's a labor tax, so it's not paid in money but paid in labor. They can be used freely to build or maintain these structures that they need to. Richelieu abolishes fortified cities finally. So even though that's begun under Henry IV and even as early as Henry II and Catherine, these fortified cities are completely destroyed. And again, as I may have mentioned to some of you when we talked about new monarchies, you can see this in places like Boulogne on the coast of France, where the walls have giant holes in them from places that Richelieu's cannons have fired through because the village refused to tear their wall down, so he did it for them. Under Richelieu, something called the Peace of Alais happens, which is really important. This is a complete turnaround on the Edict of Nantes. What this does is this basically restricts almost all Huguenots and Protestants in the practice of their faith. It refuses them the ability to pass any kind of religiously specific law, so laws specific to their religious beliefs. They can't have fortified cities anymore. And basically this leads to a policy later by Louis XIV that completely repeals the Edict of Nantes, and Huguenots or Calvinists lose all the tolerance, religious tolerance that they gained. Richelieu is equally interested in foreign affairs. He enters into the 30 Years' War, which you read about quite a while ago, on the side of Protestants, which is crazy because he's a Catholic cardinal. But he does this to maintain the balance of power, and out of this he gains quite a bit of territory for France. In terms of taxation, Richelieu has a problem because most of the nobles and the clergy don't pay any taxes. They're supposed to, but they don't, and nobody is willing to enforce that taxation. And Richelieu isn't entirely certain of how to manage that problem, and in fact, none of the kings from Louis XIII until Louis XVI really ever figure out a good system for forcing the nobles to pay their taxes. So this causes serious problems down the road. Once Louis XIII dies, his his son, Louis XIV, is crowned king. He's only 5 years old, and this is the moment when nobles realize this is their last time, their last shot at trying to reestablish power, because he's only 5. And so they assume that, you know what, if they can either kill him or if they can just exile him and take the throne for themselves, or even kidnap him and force him to do what they ask, they will regain their power. And so what ensues is something called the Fronde. And the Fronde is this attempt by the nobles basically to overthrow Louis, like I just said. He escapes, actually, goes into exile for a few short months with his new regent, Mazarin, but he survives. And because he survives, he is actually able to come back with reinforcements to Paris, to France. The Fronde falls apart while he's in exile because the aristocracy don't want to work with the rising merchant class, or what are going to be called later the bourgeoisie. And because they're not willing to work together, and because they hire Spanish mercenaries, the French people don't support them. And they lose the power of support, and because of this, Louis XIV is able to regain control. When Louis does come back, he establishes his court with extreme authority, but he does it very cleverly. He's not like Dum-Dum Charles I. He's very good at establishing control and putting practices in place that are covert in the way that they control the nobles. Underneath it all, Louis is an absolutist, and he is, of course, the best example of absolutism. He subscribes to Bishop Bousset's belief, which is a Catholic bishop who believes that the scripture in Ecclesiastes, which says, let no one judge the judge, is the basis for this idea that kings and absolutism is divinely appointed by God. So Louis loves this idea that God and God alone is Louis's judge. He is only answerable to God. He does not have to follow what anybody else says. But like I said, he's very clever about the way he implements policies that reflect this. For one, Louis continues, after he becomes of age and becomes king himself, a long tradition of conferring with the local town councils, or as they're called in France, actually parliaments, before he passes major legislation that will affect their cities. Now, he doesn't have to do this, and he certainly doesn't do it all the time, but he does it enough to make the people in those cities, or make people in France feel like he still cares about their opinion and their input. And so he kind of gets around it that way. The other thing that Louis does right away is that he's only 5'4", but he's the master of propaganda. And one thing he's great at, one thing he does that shows this is that when his son is born, he appears on the balcony with his son dressed as a Roman emperor. And of course, this is awe-inspiring to the peasants that see him. And this just continues to maintain this kind of all-powerful Roman image of Louis. Louis maintains the intendants that Louis XIII and Richelieu kept in place. He continues to appoint the intendants from the middle class. He also appoints his chief ministers from the middle class. The nobility are actually banned from daily councils, so they're not even allowed to participate in daily government at his court. But he's very good, again, at distracting them. He doesn't come out and say, no more daily government. He poses it as, oh, you have so many other things that you need to do. You surely don't have time to be involved in the daily government. And so because of this, the nobles, he provides distractions for them. Some of those, most of them actually include Versailles, which we'll get to in a minute. But Versailles is like one of those blue insect lights. It is the great distractor for the nobles, and it works beautifully. It's like an adult playground. In terms of the Estates General, which is the closest thing to a British Parliament that France has, it never meets under Louis's 72-year-long reign. It never once meets. He never calls the Estates General. And that is simply because the tax system in France is not dependent on its meeting like it is in Britain. So Louis can continue to raise taxes, he can continue to collect them, he can introduce new ones because there's no tradition of the Estates General controlling taxes in France. So they never meet. Louis also develops an army. He turns an army that was at 100,000, which was already the largest army in Europe, to an army of over 400,000 men, which is unbelievably large. It's like the 2 million man army in North Korea, although I'm sure more effective. So he goes about really turning France into the most powerful country in Europe. He's able to do this once again because he can collect taxes. He does it efficiently because he appoints ministers from the middle class. Most of the time, those ministers are very capable, so they're very efficient with their job. France itself is a very agriculturally rich country, and so the revenue streams that they have are just really phenomenal. Unfortunately, though, Louis does not manage the money well by the time he is an older king, and even with all of the money pouring into France, it's used up almost completely on his pet project, which of course is Versailles. Versailles is an old hunting lodge. It's 12 miles outside of Paris. Its ultimate cost was $1 billion, and yes, you heard that correctly. The grounds of Versailles are 37,000 acres. Just to give you an idea of kind of the monumental force it took to build this palace that Louis was so obsessed with, it took 36,000 bricklayers, 6,000 horses, and 20 years to complete. Once done, it had over 1,400 fountains, 1,200 orange trees, and over 400 sculptures. To give you an idea of the opulence and really just kind of the excess of this place, it had the Hall of Mirrors, which you can see, although I have to tell you personally, I don't think it's that impressive. But anyways, it's 243 feet long. It has 17 arched mirrors. Each of those mirrors are 33 feet tall. And the mirrors alone for this building cost $1 million. Versailles housed 5,000 nobles. The total palace grounds population, once it was built and everyone was there, was 10,000 people. And again, it's built as almost a Baroque style structure in that it's this dramatic structural building. Heavy ornamentation, arches and domes and colonnades, fountains, red and gold, and red and gold are everywhere, all over the place. The doors on the palace are built to open up to the outside so that you can use both spaces at once if you want to. It's really an absolutely beautiful but also excessive palace that eventually bankrupts the country. So it's an incredibly foolish financial, architectural scheme, but it does work for Louis. It works for him to distract the nobles. Within the Palace of Versailles, if you are lucky enough to be a noble there, and only the most powerful are there, you can have whatever you want to eat. There are all kinds of both sexuals, athletic, every kind of pleasure you could ever imagine is there. And Louis invites all of the most powerful nobles to come and live with him there. And he does this, obviously, so that he can watch over them. And over time, the nobles just give in because it's a nice place to be. He also introduces things like gambling, which ends up keeping the nobles indebted to the king, which is another great scheme. And again, over time, the nobles just kind of gravitate towards Versailles. They're develops around Louis a cult. So, for example, if you're especially favored, you may be given the opportunity to see Louis wake up in the morning, literally, or you may get to see him pee, which is really bizarre, or you may get to see him go to sleep. All right, all of these are privileges that you're granted if you have a special favor with the king. The other aspect of Louis is the economic side. So obviously the palace is a problem. But in terms of the economics, the reason he has so much money and the reason he's able to build this is in large part thanks to his finance minister, a man named Colbert. Colbert is a brilliant financier, and he puts into place many positive reforms in the country, although he's, again, never able to get a hold on nobles who don't pay taxes. This is the reforms that Colbert puts into place are generally referred to as Colbertism. He also develops the scheme of mercantilism, which we'll talk both about in a second. First, let's talk about Colbertism. Colbertism is this. First of all, what he does is he implements a system called the 5 Great Farms, which is essentially an area within France that does not have tariffs. Up until Colbert, every region of France, including those 32 districts that I talked about with the Intendants that Richelieu and Louis XIII created, had to pay a tariff if they did trade with each other. This is obviously an absurd system of commerce because nobody wants to pay these tariffs, so trade is really stifled. Colbert removes these tariffs so that you have a free trade zone within France that is almost the entire northern half of France, and this alone opens up an immense amount of wealth in trade that the country is able to capitalize on. In terms of the commercial code, Colbert puts into place the idea that you have to regulate the quality of goods. So this ends up replacing guilds, those organizations where people have to spend years learning how to do a certain craft, and then you have to pay them exorbitant amounts of money for high quality goods. This replaces that because now there's just quality standards across the board. Okay. A large part he does this because this allows merchants who are participating in the age of exploration to now openly find and trade and be assured of the quality of the products that people are making with the supplies they're bringing back from overseas. Colbert also establishes the French East India Company, which is a powerful organization similar to the British East India Company. It helps France to develop a powerful navy. So to give you an idea, in 1661, France goes from having 18 ships. In 1681, they have 276 ships, which is just unbelievably huge. He bans food exports because he wants to keep the price of bread down, which is actually very smart in terms of making sure that peasants are fed. However, he does continue one incredibly ruinous taxation policy, and that is a policy of selling offices to the highest bidder. Now, this is obviously done under Louis XI, it's done under Francis I, it's done under Henry II, but he really accelerates this policy, and Louis XIV goes crazy with it. Louis XIV is able to raise an exorbitant amount of funds for his military, because remember, it's 400,000 men. The problem, though, is that once people pay for a title of nobility, they are now, like the rest of the nobles, unofficially exempt from taxes, which means that Louis is not only depleting his tax base, but he's destroying the future economy of France, because people, these men called nobles of the robe, which you already learned about under Francis I, are the wealthiest men in France, and now they don't have to pay taxes. So the economy is going way down. The king also annuls town charters and sells them back. So in other words, towns don't have to pay a charter fee anymore to be a town. And this is a long a complicated system that you don't need to know, but just know that he no longer requires towns to pay this in an effort to curry favor from them. He also starts to sell government and military offices, which causes problems because now instead of capable middle-class merchants getting positions, it's just the rich ones who could very well and are, in a lot of cases, stupid. The other aspect is the mercantilism. And mercantilism is this idea that you maximize exports. So as you increase your colonial possessions overseas, which France is also doing, the importance of doing this is so that they have markets to sell their goods, as well as accumulate wealth, in particular gold, at home. So mercantilism is the idea that you want to expand your export market as well as consolidate or gain as much gold as you possibly can. The last part of kind of Louis's policies are his religious policies. Louis is under the impression, unlike Henry IV, his grandfather, that religious toleration is not the way forward, but religious unity. Everybody should be one faith, right? And so he actually ends up in two problems. One, he has to deal with a new movement in France called the Jansenists, or the Jansenists. The Jansenists are they're a religious group within the Catholic Church who feel like even the Jesuits are too forgiving. So they're a very, very fanatic sect. But they are unique in that they actually like many of Luther's policies. So they're kind of a weird mix of the most fanatical Catholics and fanatical Lutherans, who claim to be Catholic, but many people kind of accuse them of being sort of puritanical Calvinists in a sense. One noble family in particular finds this a way to kind of undermine Louis. They're called the Arnolds, and so they kind of carry on this tradition of using religion for political power. Over time, though, Louis banishes them from France with the support of the Pope, and so the Jansenists are taken care of. However, the Huguenots are not so easy. He doesn't like them. He is staunchly Catholic, even though his grandfather was not. Unfortunately, though, he passes the Edict of Fontainebleau, he passes the Edict of Fontainebleau, which revokes the Edict of Nantes. So now Huguenots no longer have any toleration. This causes something called the Holy Terror. Nothing actually happens, but Huguenots are so horrified that he's done this that over a series of a couple of years, 50,000 Huguenots leave France. And we'll get to this later on in the week, but the King of Prussia, which is a developing nation next to France, recognizes the potential in many of these Huguenots who are very wealthy and successful businessmen, and promises them tax exemptions if they come to Prussia. So Prussia gets the lion's share, and of course the rest of them go to Holland, which is this religious kind of tolerant place. Finally, because of this, France loses an enormous proportion of their skilled craftsmen as well as a middle class. But again, Prussia gains all of this, and you'll see how this affects the rise of Prussia later. So this ends up working out very well for them. All right, next time when we meet, we will talk about the wars of Louis XIV. I'm certainly not going to do that now because my voice is almost completely going. We'll talk about the wars. With the time that you have left, which is quite a bit, you have about an hour. I would like you to spend that time reading the Absolutism section for your reading quiz next week. I have a classroom copy that you can use, and I think that would be the best use of your time. So thank you for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And if this is Monday and I'm still out, I hope happy Monday and you have a wonderful week. Talk to you later.